The True History of Religion, How Religion Destroys the Human Race, and What the Real Illuminati has attempted to do through religion to save the human race. Introduction. Religion is the main reason that the people of this world do not unite together as a human race to help each other and to solve humanity's problems. Now, we doubt that there's anyone who disagrees with this, but we're sure that there are billions who blame the problem not on their particular religion, but on everyone else's. You see, folks, people want to believe that their religion is the panacea to solve everyone's problems, to solve the world's problems. And if everybody else in the world would just adhere to what their religion says, what their God says, then perhaps the world will change. But there's hundreds and thousands of different belief systems in the world, and each believes the same thing. But no belief system has ever properly introduced a religious concept or an idea that will save this world. Thus, you can see how everybody thinks they're right, which makes everybody wrong. There are many religions in this world, and if we were to go and spend the time to explain to you everything there is to know about what we know about the world's religions, this book could be many volumes. Instead, we've chosen to concentrate our efforts of disclosure on the religions that hold the most power over current humanity, especially the few main religions that pull all of the economic strings in the world, that have turned all of Earth's inhabitants into puppets. No one can live without being controlled by these puppeteers. Because all of humanity's problems center around economic disparity and inequality, and solving this would greatly enhance humanity's chances at survival. The focus of this book will be on the main religions that started the economic structures that control our modern world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Who is the first of these religions is going to step up and say the obvious, again, that everyone is right, which makes everyone wrong? If you believe that your religion is the right one, understand that all other religious believers think the same thing. Who is the first one that's going to admit that their religion is actually part of the problem? Will the Jews be the first to admit that none of the events or characters presented in their Torah are any more factual or real than those created by the ancient Greeks, which are now generally accepted as myths? Will it be the Christians who finally step up? What about the Muslims? But would the Christians or Muslims even have to step up and admit it if the Jews did first, because Christianity and Islam would not exist without Judaism? We could have mentioned all of the other major religions in the world, but when honestly considered, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims are those who are currently causing most of the world's problems today. And why would the leaders of these religions admit something that would destroy their worth to their followers? They would never admit anything like this. If they did admit that their religion was part of the problem, it would cause these leaders to lose the tithing, the praise, and the honor that their followers give to them. Most religious leaders in the world know not that they know not. A few of them know that their religion is not even reality. But these few are backed up against a potential wall of ridicule and rejection that's built and supported by their followers. These realize that they would lose everything that supports them and gives them purpose if they admitted that their religion is part of the world's problems. These few continue to play the role for their own sakes. It doesn't matter to them what their religion is doing to the world. It serves their personal needs, and all they can do is hope that it serves the needs of their followers. There's an old saying that we invented and introduced in various ways in different cultures in the past. Quote, "He who knows not, and knows not that he knows not, is a fool. Shun him. He who knows not and knows that he knows not is simple. Teach him. He who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep. Wake him. He who knows and knows that he knows is wise. Follow him." Religious and secular leaders, teachers and scholars, all the know-nots who think they know, these know nothing of substantial worth to solve the problems facing humanity. The more knowledge the people of the world appear to be getting from their religious and secular leaders, teachers, and scholars, the more problems the human race seems to be experiencing. If all of their knowledge was really that good, wouldn't it be making the world better instead of worse? This book is not for these fools. This book is for the simple and those asleep. This book is written in a very simple format. We've made every effort to use simple terms and words to share our message with the world. Sometimes we give the definition of a word or term in parentheses, so that a common reader might understand. This is to help the simple, who might not have the time and means that it takes to learn lots of big words. We write this way to be condescending, disrespectful, not to the simple-minded reader, but to the fools who think they are better than others. These fools use big words and teach through superfluous forms of pedagogical gesticulations, and this is the way that educated people write to teach their opinion. We do not respect how the fools like to use these words, as if their words must be the real facts because of the way that they are presented to others. These fools are the few. This book was written for the people living on earth in a way to give everyone the equal chance of understanding its message. There are way too many books written by the few, for the few, and only the few can afford to buy each other's books. Their books are not written for those who cannot afford to buy a book, nor are their books written for those who cannot read. Their books are not written for those who do not understand what their, quote, superfluous forms of pedagogical gesticulations means. To the few, those whom they consider, quote unquote, uneducated people and poor readers, do not buy their books because they are, quote unquote, uneducated and poor readers, which is condescending to he who knows and knows not that he knows. When the simple-minded read something, and it agrees with their common sense, what they read is confirmed, not as something necessarily new, but as something that makes sense to them. This sense, which should be common among us, that's why it's called common sense, is often affected by what each person learns from the time of our childhood. If the adults of this world returned their sense about things over to the little children of this world, what would these little children tell us? Can we remember what it was like to be a little child? Can we remember what we knew or didn't know then? None of us knew anything about religion as a little child. The few might mock the information in this book that we provide to the rest of humanity because it destroys the pretense, the deception of their value in the world for being educated as they perceive themselves. They might mock this book because it is free to download and read online, because they write books to get money or praise. They might mock this book because no author takes personal credit for the information or for the success of the book, if any there might be. There is little doubt that the few fools are going to mock us, the real Illuminati, for our claims to be ones who know and know that we know, and therefore are wise. Follow us. If the simple and asleep take the time to read this book, they will know who the fools are and who the wise are. Upon pondering the information given in this book, the wisdom and understanding of the few fools who have convinced others that they know shall begin to perish. When the wisdom of the wise and the understanding of the prudent come up against things that make more sense than what they teach, especially to the simple-minded, this diminishes their value. Their value begins to perish. Once confronted with real truth that makes more sense to the common person, although they pretended to share it with prudence, carefully and cleverly, the few will want to hide their teachings and their understanding of things so the comparison cannot be made. If information is presented that makes more sense than anything that the simple and asleep have been taught or believe, and the simple and asleep confront the person who taught them what makes less sense than the new information that they're hearing, these few fools will want to hide and not face what they cannot dispute rationally. We mock the very reason why most people write books. When a fictional story is not presented, books are written to express the author's opinion as fact. These are the non-fiction books. They contain specifics that the majority doesn't have the patience or the time to read. The majority are so tired and emotionally drained by the daily grind required of them that they don't want to think about any heavy information. They want a story. If presented as a story, a book is usually fiction. Even stories that are based on actual facts are often more fiction than fact because they are presented in such a way that it entices a person to read the story and to be entertained. The most successful books throughout history have always been fictional stories that captivate the reader and do not require a person to think much. These books are successful because they are written as a story, the intricate and difficult details of which must be filled in by the imagination of the reader. However, the more details that are presented in telling the story, the less the reader has to think and the less energy a person has to use to fill in the blanks. These are the most successful books. If you were to research the list of the most successful books in history, you would find that most of them, all of them, in fact, are fantasy. The majority of people pick up a book to read in order to be entertained. Yes, there are the few who pick up a book to learn things that make them think that they are smarter than those who are entertained. These books are school books, scientific publications, and other writings that are presented as nonfiction. Consider the most successful book in the world. Is it fantasy or fact? We are going to prove to the world, to the few and to the majority, that the most successful book of all time is, in fact, as all other successful books are, just a fantasy. But when we mention the name of this book, the reader who believes that the book is not fantasy will condemn us and read no further. But why? If the book is fact, then nothing that can be written or said about it will ever prove it to be a fantasy. Wouldn't common sense prevail in deciding? Why would you fear reading any new information then? The fear comes from a person not wanting to be wrong. We value ourselves on what we believe is the truth, especially those truths that define us, that control our lives and give us personal value and worth. Few will take the chance to be proven wrong. But what if the most successful book in history is the cause of all our mortal problems on earth? Well, not the book itself exactly, but rather the perception held by the majority that it is not fiction. But what if the majority changed their minds and no longer accepted the book as fact, but rather just as fantastical as the books that entertain them? Wouldn't this change in perception help heal the problems that the book has caused? What if the few who created the book created it in order to control the majority? Isn't it true that fantasies and stories can control people? What effect does the idea of Santa Claus, making a list and checking it twice, gonna find out who's naughty or nice, have on a child's mind? Santa Claus is a huge success, not only at controlling the child's behavior, but in marketing and making money. The most successful book in the world is the Bible. It was created by the few to control the rest. It is a fantasy that has been presented by the few as fact in order to provoke certain behaviors from the majority. It actually details a list that God checks twice in order to find out who's naughty or nice. If God checks his list and finds out you're nice, you're going to be saved and go to heaven. If you're naughty, you're going to hell, at least according to the stories of the Bible. Consider all of the books that have ever been written. Consider all of the knowledge that has been expressed in all of the books that have ever been written. That's a lot of knowledge, folks. But what good has any of this knowledge done for the majority? Sure, it has benefited the few, because they are the only ones who read most of it and value themselves based on what they read and memorize. Because isn't that all that most college degrees are? The reading and memorization of knowledge that a student gets from a book or from a professor who got it from a book. But the world is getting worse for the majority of humanity. But it seems to be doing pretty good for the few, at least currently. Let's give these few an actual number. Let's call them the 1%. There are about 8 billion people in the world. 1% of 8 billion is 80 million people. Honestly, however, there are probably not 80 million people on Earth. who are not slaves to someone else, or rather, dependent on someone else for the basic necessities required for their personal life. How many people are millionaires, financially independent? Let's say about 14 million. How many people are billionaires? Let's say about 2,200. Let's very generously round off the financially independent to 20 million people. That's 1/4 of 1%. 1/4 of 1% of the world's population. But we do not fault these few. How can we find fault with these few when the majority want to be part of the few? The few control the money and provide jobs. Without that income, the majority wouldn't be able to live. Without the few, it's honestly hard to imagine a world like the one in which we live today. The few are responsible for the incredible advancements in technology and innovation. But let's not forget that these advancements benefit the few much more than they do the majority. Still, how can the majority fault them when the majority wishes to be them? The greatest civilizations on Earth during the past 10,000 years are a result of the efforts of the few, not the majority. The only exception to this is from the labor that the majority provides, doing what the few wants them to do, like building the great pyramids and skyscrapers, for example. Civilization advanced and progressed upon Earth until it had discovered, as it supposed, the ultimate innovation in politics, business, social welfare, and national warfare. This was known as the Great Roman Empire. Up to that point, the world had never known a united group of people like this great empire. Its decadence, leisure, and world dominance permeated every aspect of life. Its soldiers meted out death to any individual or to any nation that stood against it. Its sporting events included barbaric acts of competition and brutal human sacrifices. The Romans delivered thousands to their deaths at the fangs and claws of the beasts of the earth. It literally created hell on earth for the majority in order to entertain the few. The great Roman political policies created a very wealthy class of relatively few individuals with great power. This consequently created a middle class, which buffered the impact that absolute wealth and power had on the majority of people. This majority included the poor laboring class, who always suffered in poverty. Throughout history, the poor majority had been able to rise up and overthrow the few in power when the situation called sufficiently for reformation. But when an economic middle class existed, revolution decreased. Teetering on the edge of wealth and believing that they could become just as the wealthy, the middle class stood between the rich and poor, coveting the rich and fearing a return to being poor, thus validating the actions of the rich while pacifying the cries of the poor. The military strength of this type of human civilization, the great Roman Empire, for example, overpowers weaker nations and leaves many desolate. It causes thousands of deaths from the effects of war, hunger, disease, and poverty left over from its military conquests and occupations. There is no part of this type of civilization that promotes equality among the masses, because it wasn't envisioned and established by or for the majority. It exists by and for the benefit of the few. The United States of America eventually replaced the great Roman Empire in modern times. Envisioned by the few, it was established by the few. Wisely, these few created a constitution, which, if followed as it was written, would always benefit the majority. So the majority were deceived into believing. The original U.S. Constitution established a Congress of Representatives elected by the majority to represent the will of the people. This would have worked well, especially for the majority, but not so much for the powerful few. In 1788, the original United States Constitution was ratified. That means that it was approved by the people's representatives. At that time, it did not include a U.S. Senate as part of Congress. Once accepted, the People's Congress began to establish laws that did not sit well with the few. The laws that were being established were benefiting the majority. The few had to do something to protect their minority rights and needs, because after a short time, The few could definitely see the threat to them. So in 1789, just a year later, the framers of the Constitution created the United States Senate to protect the rights of the few and, quote-unquote, safeguard minority opinion. From that time forward, no law could be passed by the House of Representatives without the approval of the Senate. The few dodged a bullet to the head. At first, all U.S. senators were appointed by the rich few. It took over 100 years before the majority uncovered this great deception. It was in 1913 when the American people were finally able to vote for their senators. The few began to lose their power over the majority. But these few still maintained a great power and influence over the lives of the majority. The majority still depended solely on the few for a paycheck. A series of events led to the Great Depression, after which the U.S. government realized that it needed to do something to maintain its power and control over the people. At that time, they started providing people with free food, free housing, and free health care. But the American majority was a proud majority, especially the middle-class people. They didn't want handouts, they wanted jobs. The U.S. middle class served the same purpose that it did for the great Roman Empire again. Teetering on the edge of wealth and believing that they could become just as the wealthy, the middle class stood between the rich and poor, coveting the rich and fearing a return to being poor, thus validating the actions of the rich while pacifying the cries of the poor. The few who controlled things knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to pacify the cries of the poor. But now they needed the help and support of the middle class, people who wanted to be just like them. They needed the middle class to vote for their senators. Although their pride keeps the American people from admitting it, they are easily deceived by the powers that control them. Americans need their government. They need the help of the few, because they want to be one of the few. The United States learned no valuable lessons from the fall of its predecessor, the great Roman Empire. The Romans existed for about 1,000 years before things started spiraling out of control. At this writing, the United States has only existed for not quite 1/3 of that time. But the divisions in American society created by bipartisan politics are the exact same divisions experienced by the Romans before the fall of their civilization. There was one book that saved the Roman Empire from complete devastation: the Bible. Well, the Bible didn't actually save anyone, but it was used by the Roman government to control the people who were about to rise up in revolution to destroy it. Using the Bible as its authority, part of the great Roman Empire was able to transform into the great European nations of medieval times. These European nations also rose to power by using the same Bible as their authority. The Bible has now also inspired American policy and action more than any other book, more than any other philosophy of man mingled with Scripture. The Bible inspired the creation of a Christian state, a Christian government, even when the separation between church and state was supposed to be the basis of a righteous constitution. In the United States, who is it that determines if something is unconstitutional or not? The United States Supreme Court. 9 individuals control the lives of the rest of the American people because of their power to interpret the laws of the United States. But consider the real truth about how these 9 people do their daily tasks as the most powerful group of people on earth. The Supreme Court begins on the first Monday in October and continues until late June or early July. They all get salaries and get a 3-month recess, paid vacation. They only allow verbal argument while the court is in session from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. That's just 2 hours. While the court is not in session, the justices are supposed to review the cases before the court and prepare their decisions. Each justice is allowed to hire up to 4 clerks who are the ones who actually do all the work. Most of the justices begin their day with a personal prayer in chambers to their particular personal God. They pray to their personal God to guide them and help them make the right choice. Currently, There are 3 Jewish and 6 Christian judges sitting on the most powerful court on earth. When each of them pray, they pray to the God of the Bible, hoping to receive direct inspiration from this God. When the court is in session, the 10 a.m. entrance of the justices into the courtroom is announced by the marshal. Those present, at the sound of the gavel, arise and remain standing until the robed justices are seated, following the traditional chant. Quote, "The Honorable, the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court." They are asking the God of the Bible to save the United States and this honorable court. So where's the separation between church and state? It's this honorable court that prepares the list that God checks twice. A person is nice if the person obeys the laws that the court upholds. A person is naughty if they do not. These 9 people are the ones who interpret which laws are constitutional and which ones are not. These 9 people are far from separated from religion. As the chant that introduces and recognizes their authority reveals, these powerful humans represent the epitome of religion, the few making rules in order to control the rest. The majority have little understanding about the powers that control their lives. Most have no idea how laws are made. All they know is how these laws are forced upon them. They either obey or they are jailed or killed for disobedience. We will reveal in this book how we created a new source of quote-unquote God's will of Scripture for the American people in the early 19th century. That's the early 1800s. We created it to introduce new concepts that might open people's minds and change their views on Christianity. We created a story for that book. It was our hope that the American Christians would relate to the story and consider it to be a story about their present condition. In our story, we tried to inspire the reader to, quote, liken all scriptures unto themselves, that it might be for their profit and learning, unquote. In our new scripture, we made it very clear about what was happening in the modern American legal system. Quote, "And now behold, I say unto you, that the foundation of the destruction of this people is beginning to be laid by the unrighteousness of your lawyers and your judges," unquote. In order to avoid the same destruction that the ancient Romans experienced, the change must come from within the powers that control the people, starting with the lawyers and judges. To change these institutions, people must first understand them. Violence has never worked. Revolution has never made lasting changes. No matter how strong the revolutions, no matter how massive the protests, the majority has failed every time to make this world a better place of fairness and equality for all. The majority does not possess the physical strength to overthrow the secret combination of political, philosophical, religion, and science, and the business powers that control them. If the majority can learn anything from history, it is that no revolution of any kind, of any number, of any strength will be successful at overthrowing the few. Because when the majority has overthrown the few, they reappoint another few to start the same cycle of secret combinations all over again and again. Lasting change will never occur by the sword of physical strength. In this book, the world will discover that we, the real Illuminati, were the ones responsible for the book of Revelation in the Bible. We will provide the evidence of this in the last chapter. The book of Revelation is a disclosure of what we know will save the human race. Although presented in religious symbolism in order to reach the Christian world that controls not only the Supreme Court of the United States, but most of the other powerful nations on earth, when the symbolism of Revelation is unfolded, one of the clues we gave will finally be understood. Quote, "If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." Unquote. The Roman and American governments were not and are not successful at controlling their people through military power. But they were able to control their people by another power that is stronger than any physical power on earth: belief. We do have something to say that is very condescending about the majority. Folks, the few know a lot more than you do. They know a lot more about you than you know about yourselves. They use this knowledge to control you for their sake, believing that it is also for your sake. The only way that you will be able to fight the few and make changes that benefit you is for you to know more of the right things, more of the real truth, than they know. The few do not have the solutions to humanity's problems. Although the few claim access to a lot of knowledge, all that has been accumulated during the last 10,000 years of human history, none of it has done humanity any good. None of it. This knowledge does, however, serve the needs of the few at the expense of the majority. The only way to reverse this trend and save humanity is for the majority to have access to knowledge that the few refuse to accept. We have written this book to give you this knowledge.